I'd like to introduce our speaker. This is Al Zelaya. He is an urban forester with the Davey Institute. His responsibilities include development, research training, website administration, and providing technical support for domestic as well as international iTree projects. Al came to Salt Lake City in 2010 to teach an iTree workshop, and I think the first time I met him might have been in 2007. Back in West Virginia. So he's been around since the beginning of all of this and has a lot of information. Al has over 15 years of experience working in urban forestry, arboriculture, and natural areas management in the state, county, and local levels. Al is an ISA certified arborist and has a BA from DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois. Al also serves as a member of the instructor cadre for the Society for Municipal Arborists Municipal Forestry Institute program, which I know many of you have also attended. So with that, I will turn it over to Al. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Meredith. I appreciate the opportunity to join you all, and thank you to you folks who have taken time out of your day to learn a little bit more about iTree. So we have a lot planned for you, and I will go ahead and just advance through. What I'd kind of like to do when talking with Meredith about mostly focusing on the state of iTree use in Utah, so I thought it'd be good to give you a overview of some of the things that we're working on, but also to provide you with some strategies and tools that I think that can help you use iTree today. So there's a lot that's going on right now with development work, which are tools, new tools in the pipeline, updates on existing tools, but then there are tools that I think that are very easy to use that you can hopefully either try to work into your toolbox and to increase the appreciation for trees. So I'm going to kind of go over 4 different applications. We'll stop somewhere midpoint just to see if there's any burning questions so that we don't lose anything in the process. So I will go ahead, and what I'm going to do is just quickly kind of start to fill in the background so we have a foundation, and then we'll start diving into the tools. So just the very basics for folks who aren't familiar, iTree is essentially a software suite that was developed by the U.S. Forest Service and its partners, and those partners are all listed down at the bottom. I'm with the Davey Institute, the Arbor Day Foundation, Society of Municipal Arborists, ISA, Casey Trees, and more recently, State University ESF program has helped us develop the iTree Hydro model. So all these partners work collaboratively to bring these tools, which were first introduced in 2006. And so we're coming up on almost 10 years of iTree being around, and quite a bit has changed since those original tools were first introduced back in Minneapolis at the ISA conference. So yeah, I like to use the term that it's basically putting U.S. Forest Service science into the hands of users, and somebody had the foresight of looking at all the research that was being done in urban and community forestry and saying, hey, how can we effectively take that information and turn that into usable tools so that folks can apply those to make a difference in their communities. So they're public domain tools, so they're freely accessible. You can log on to the iTree website and download them, request CDs. You can also use some of the tools which are online, and I'll show you those a little bit further down. They're based on science, so the foundation of these tools is based on peer-reviewed science, provide technical support for the tools, and much of what I do is kind of manage those systems with the technical support in the background. So I help people use all these different tools throughout the day, and not just nationally but internationally. So about a third of the folks we help now are overseas, and are continuously improved. So it's a dynamic system, and we're constantly integrating in new research, developing new tools, and it's one of the things that's really exciting about iTree. And we use the premise of the benefit-based approach for iTree. And I like to think of this as a continuum or a progression. So that structure really is the keystone, though. And so urban forest structure, what are the species, the size distribution, spatial distribution, orientation to buildings, those are decisions that we make as managers, as homeowners even. And that then has consequences in terms of what are the environmental services that that resource is going to be providing. And so that's what iTree helps us move along this progression from just basic asset management tools and tree inventory tools, which might give us good information on species and distribution, but then trying to find out what are those trees providing in terms of ecosystem services, whether that's carbon sequestration, air quality improvement, stormwater effects, or energy effects. And then also trying to monetize those values. So using economic literature then to apply monetary values to some of those services, and recognizing that the iTree tools can only capture and provide estimates for a certain amount of services. There's many different benefits that trees provide that we can't quantify. So this is really just a snapshot of some things that we can now quantify that we have not been able to. And I like to think that that gives us the information which allows us to be more effective in terms of our management, advocacy, and planning. So I see it as a continuum, but then it's also a loop too, so that you can evaluate how effective you are and then make those adjustments. So if you want to change a structure to change the environmental services, what are the values that societies hold most dear? And so that's when we can start being really strategic when we're having to deal with limited resources to be more effective, to have an urban forest that provides environmental services for the long term. And so the benefit-based approach, gives us this type of information, and this is just a graphic from the Wisconsin DNR who's used iTree streets to quantify benefits for a number of communities. And essentially, I like to think that this just allows us to take those tree urban forest resource values and then connect those with objectives that the community might hold of value. So if a community is interested in air quality issues, we then can try to tie in the natural resource to that improvement. If they're interested in stormwater issues, we can then look at the contribution of the urban natural resource there. If businesses or managers are interested in the tax base, we can look at how trees can potentially increase property values. So it allows us to make different connections where we may not have been able to in the past. So as I dive into the suite of tools, what I'm going to do today is focus on just 4 of these, and there are a number of other tools. Today I'm going to talk about design, canopy, landscape, and eco. I know that a number of you have used streets. Meredith has mentioned, I believe when Kelly Washburn was there, she was helping a number of communities, and I've seen a couple of familiar names like Wolfgang, who's done some work with streets in Arizona and so forth. So essentially, iTree Streets will remain as it is, and it's been pretty static as one of the iTree tools for a number of years with some slight modifications. So that will still be part of the suite in 2015 going forward. iTree Hydro is a newer tool also. I'm not going to talk about that today. We could probably dedicate a whole webinar to that in the future if folks are interested. But that is essentially a tool that looks at the effects of canopy cover and impervious surface and how that affects stream flow and water quality. It's a little bit more of a sophisticated modeling tool in that it's different in some of the other iTree tools where you have to set up the model, calibrate it, and then you do scenario modeling. So you adjust the canopy and impervious surface and then look at how that changes different outputs. So it's more of a hydrology modeling tool as opposed to, say, a tool like Streets, which gives you somewhat of a benefit and attaches a monetary value. Hydro doesn't do that, but it's a very sophisticated model, and some of the background methodologies we're now integrating into iTree Eco. So one of the things that I think of when I think of the iTree tools and what makes a tool successful, it boils down to 2 things for me, and it's accessibility and value, those 2 terms. And so it has to be something that folks can access and use. Can you get to the finish line? That's important. We know that there are some complex tools, and that's difficult for folks to make it to the end, or there's a huge time requirement. And then the other question, value. Does it provide the user with value? And so those are the 2 things that I always look at being the conduit where I help people use tools, and then I work with the developers on the back end to try to improve tools and test tools and so forth. So those 2 things always come to mind. And one of the things that has been really positive about iTree is the development of the web-based tools, so Design and Canopy, which are our most popular tools, and then Landscape, which is coming down the pipeline. iTree Eco is one of the tools that we've been doing a huge amount of work on right now, so I'm hoping that tool, which has a pretty high bar in terms of user requirements, we're going to modify that, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, and hopefully that'll become more accessible because it does provide tremendous value. So I also told Meredith that I try to look at a little bit of some of the user numbers just in Utah and the region in general. And I like to call this, we call this the iTree tool user map. And so this is essentially just kind of a proxy based on downloads and CD requests. So it's not necessarily, we don't have 3 users in Papua New Guinea, but 3 folks from there have downloaded or requested the iTree software. We don't always know to the extent that anybody's really using all the tools, but sometimes we can monitor some of the tools like iTree, Eco, Canopy, and Design because they're online. Eco still has some systems that require processing on our servers, so we can monitor their use. So we use this somewhat as a proxy to gauge where we have interest. And so, yeah, iTree really has, I don't know if this was the intention of the people that started the program before I joined, it's about 6-7 years ago, but we now have established relationships in Australia, Canada, and the UK where we've expanded the use of the model. And then we have more interest in other parts of Europe and Asia and South America too. So it's one of these things that's really kind of kept us busy and pulled us in many directions where we probably weren't anticipating we'd end up. And more locally, you can kind of just get an idea. This map was based on April 2015, so fairly recent, and you can see where Utah ranks somewhere in the middle in terms of requests for the CDs and downloading the software. So it doesn't necessarily mean that folks are doing anything specific with the tools, but it just gives us an idea of where we have interest in some of the areas where we don't. And I also monitor some of the requests for service and questions and so forth. So we know that there's a heavy user base in the Northeast and in the Midwest and in some of the more populated areas along the West and down South too. And as I look through each one of these tools, I'll try to give you some user information that will tie this back into what we're seeing in Utah and that region. So let's start with Eco. So Eco is one of the tools that we consider this one of the flagships. And so this was developed by Dave Nowak at the Northern Research Station and a number of his colleagues. And this is a field-based assessment tool. And it was originally designed to look at an assessment of a whole city, basically. And the original protocol called for approximately generating 200 random plots throughout an area of interest. And those plots are a 1/10 acre, so roughly about 37.5 foot radius throughout a city, randomly located throughout a city. It takes typically a summer for 2 people to go out to those plots, and you would have to go there and collect information about all the vegetation, ground cover, relationship of trees to buildings and so forth. So very labor intensive initially, and as in the top picture you can see that a random plot could land in the middle of a field, it could land in the middle of a street, it could land in the middle of a forest where you don't really know what you're going to get into until you get on site. And so that could be maybe 2 large trees in that plot, or it could be many small trees. So it could be a long haul in terms of the data collection aspect, or it could go rather quickly. But generally, overall, it took about a summer for a crew to go through and do a city-scale assessment. More recently, iTree Eco has been adapted to allow for single tree assessments. So in the lower part, say a city park, if people wanted to use the same protocol, they then could just enter the parameters for the trees and not necessarily needing the plot information and then get some of the same type of ecosystem services. But still, it required a number of different tree variables, so about a dozen different variables that were required for Eco. So it wasn't just species and DBH and tree condition, it also required tree height, canopy height, and a number of variables, which essentially allowed you to provide data so that the model would have enough information to determine functional leaf surface to then use that to produce the estimates of ecosystem services. A huge variety of functional and structural results from those types of assessments with iTree Eco. And so what did it provide? As I mentioned, structural information, so species distribution, condition, leaf area, leaf biomass, things like that. But then the functional aspects too. So it also had energy effect information related to the trees, proximity and orientation to nearby buildings, air quality improvement. It also had carbon sequestration and storage capability estimates, and then it also did an avoided runoff simulation. One of the more recent improvements with ECO is that it has a human health component. So it uses an EPA benefit map analysis program to look at the reduction in pollutant concentration in the air and then tie that into human health impacts. So if pollutant concentration for ozone, PM 2.5, which is particulate matter, are being reduced, then what are the subsequent health impacts, such as reduced asthma incidence, lost days at work? So things like that, which actually can have a major impact based on air quality and human health, and then tying in monetary values to that. So we now can tie in some of those functional benefits to human health, and then also ascribing monetary values to some of those services. And then there's some management components like pest risk, tree health, and there's some things that will give you the information based on state databases on exotics and invasives based on the data that's collected. So this is what ECO currently does now, but we recognize that, yeah, it's a very robust model. So it's based on a lot of measurements, and those measurements are used to determine that functional leaf surface area. One of the other benefits to ECO, which we think is of great value, is that essentially you're providing all the information to the model that allows it to get a good grasp of what is the structural component and then how that interacts with local conditions. So you then have a somewhat of a map picker tool within the application that allows, based on your location that you enter, to go in and select a nearby station where you would get your local weather and air quality data. So you can see it's a little bit small there, but the state of Utah, there actually aren't that many monitors that we have with a lot of data, but it's still a lot better than, say, using data from Washington, Idaho, or Arizona, or elsewhere. So you can at least get a better grasp of using somewhat more localized data to do some of your modeling. So we think in terms of the value that provides, it gives folks a better quality for their data if they want to go through and do all the data collection parts. And you have a good localized model with a robust structure, and it's constantly being improved. So much of the future developments will be integrated into ECO, so there's a lot of value in engaging this tool. And we do recognize that, it is a very high bar in terms of the data collection that is required. And so what we're trying to do in the future, and so now going forward, what we're planning for ECO, it's a complete overhaul of the whole application. And so we're changing the bar, so we're going to allow folks to use ECO with DBH, species, and condition as a minimum. The application will then fill in the back-end variables, so you'll only have to provide some of those minimum variables, then it will fill in the information for tree height and so forth to allow it to do the estimates. So the accuracy of the estimates might not be as robust if you were to provide all that information, which you still can, but it allows an entry point for folks that might just have, say, a traditional park inventory or a tree inventory, and then you can take advantage of using some of that more local environmental information to do your assessments. The other thing that's changing with ECO is that if folks who are familiar with ECO, in the past, originally you used to have to send the data to the U.S. Forest Service and they would manually process it. More recently and currently, your data goes to a server and it's processed off-site, and then you have to download a results package, and that generally takes about an hour. It could be even quicker or so. But we're moving that all to the desktop, so that it's a major undertaking, and it's taken years to develop that code so that we can allow that to run totally on somebody's desktop. So that will be available in this next version of ECO for folks in the US, Canada, Australia, and the UK. But that is a huge part and why it's taking us so long. We're actually a little bit delayed in where we would like to get this next version of ECO to users. So the interface is being updated, and there's a more of a help component inside there. We're also allowing folks to pick from multiple years of weather and pollution data, whereas in the past you only had data, I think, from 2005. So you'll have more of a selection of pre-processed data in there. And then we're also trying to develop more of a simplified way to import information into the tool. One of the other features that we're going to be integrating into this next version is a forecasting component. So right now, a lot of folks are asking, how can I look at my resource going forward in time? So Alexis Ellis, who works with us at the Northern Research Station, has been working with our developers to integrate in a forecasting model, and that will allow you to do various types of scenarios to look at the impact of, say, pests or storms, tree planting, regeneration, and do some scenario modeling to look at benefits going forward in time. So we think, this model, iTree Eco, with all the new features that we're adding in and then also trying to make it more accessible, our hope is that we can eventually start to get more folks with limited data to use this, and those folks who are still interested in using it as, say, a higher grade research level type tool also to continue using it. So we're widening the door for this one. So that is iTree Eco. And this is the map of ECO in the U.S. We can keep track of this because all the projects that get processed go through a server, so we know where this is being used. And you can see here in the region, not sure if that's coming up, if I have a pointer, but in Utah, yeah, it only looks like we've had maybe one project in Park City that's been processed, and I'm not familiar with that, but I know nearby Dave Stevenson up in Idaho has done a large project in the Treasure Valley area, and the folks down at Arizona have worked to do a multi-state project with New Mexico and Texas, I believe. So there are some projects going on in the area, and we hope to increase that use in Utah going forward. So that's iTree Eco. So now I'm going to switch gears a bit, and I'm going to focus on two of the online tools. So these are tools that are available today, and I know some of you have used these, and hopefully I'll give you some ideas of how you can possibly use them in different ways if you haven't already, and if it's new to some folks, hopefully it'll give you some ideas going forward where you might be able to use these tools to possibly maybe even enhance your likelihood of doing a more complex project. I like to call these tools gateway tools sometimes, in that they can be used to justify larger projects. So iTree Design is our attempt at trying to get at smaller scale projects, parcel level. So how can we engage homeowners, schools, or the general public with a simple tool where we can take some of the features from iTree Streets and iTree Eco and allow somebody just to use a simple online tool to calculate some of the similar benefits that some of the more complex models can provide. So this was a tool that was introduced within the past 2.5 years, I believe, and it's become one of our more popular tools. And it does give you ecosystem service estimates for some of those core services: stormwater, energy, air quality, and carbon, and it helps provide some monetary estimates based on the location. So it's using some of the old streets lookup tables, but then it's sophisticated in the effect that it also uses the energy effects model from iTree Eco, where proximity and placement of trees in relationship to a parcel matter in this tool. So how does this work? I'm not sure how this will translate over the Adobe Connect, but we'll see if we can move through this. It's very simple. It's an online format, so you would just enter an address. It works better in a Firefox and Chrome browser. It will work in Explorer, but it doesn't work as well, and I believe it works fine in Apple computers too. So you just enter in your address. It then allows you to trace in your parcel, and once you do that and enter in some tree attributes, species, DBH, condition, it'll show you this grid, which will show you the deepest green color is just indicating where the highest benefit value would be. And benefit value, this tool is using a combination of all benefits, so energy, stormwater, carbon, and air pollution. It's not just energy, but you can look at the individual energy effects too as you're moving the tree around to maximize that. So if you're interested in energy, you can certainly use a tool like this to try to maximize energy effects. And the Arbor Day Foundation and a number of utilities have partnered to use this tool, or a facsimile of this tool called Energy Savings Design, which is a program where trees are given away to residents by utility using the same type tool here, which we helped develop. And so a number of other things that this does, I'm not sure, that's probably not coming through too well, it doesn't look like, but it has a crown growth modeling component, and so it'll show you the crown growth as that goes over time. It takes into effect the proximity of trees growing next to each other too. So it's sophisticated in the back end that it'll adjust some of those things. And then it'll give you a report which summarizes the current year's benefit, some of the projected benefits over time. And that's one of the things that's unique with this tool too. So we can look at current benefits, we can look at these values right here, but then we can also look at some of the future benefits. So especially for tree planting projects, I know the Alliance for Community Trees, for some of their grant projects, they require the use of this tool, so folks can actually project those benefits for tree planting projects over time. And it also looks back, so it'll look at the trees and then go back in time. So if you have a mature tree, it'll show you all the benefits that were accrued over time too. So folks use this for a number of other initiatives where they want to look at the values of larger mature trees over time. So it's a great tool, very functional, a wide variety of audiences are using this tool. So just a number of strategies. And one of the things where folks might kind of discount the value of a tool like design, oh, well, it's for homeowners, I'm an urban and community forester, a municipal forester, it's not going to help me that much. And to that I say, well, anybody that's interested in increasing community. So this is a tool that allows you to homeowners, nursery audiences where you may not have been able to engage in the past. Advocacy and outreach, as I mentioned, since the tool can calculate benefits going forward and backward, so around Arbor Day we see that this tool gets a heavy amount of usage, and so we'll see folks doing a lot of tree tags based on what they're calculating with iTree Design. We've had some folks down in Georgia doing some studies on looking at the different effects of trees around schools and comparing different schools in a school district. So you can do very simple things, you can do more complex projects with design. Many communities have sustainability efforts, and sometimes even corporate campuses or private campuses or private corporations have sustainability officers, and they're always trying to find ways that they can contribute to some of these community efforts. And oftentimes they don't know that their vegetation on their properties might actually be something that they can quantify some of those contributions to a community. So a tool like iTree Design is one of those ways that you can give somebody an easy to use tool that allows them just to get a grasp on what are some of those services that their trees might be providing to the community overall. This is another example, Pennsylvania Horticultural Society looking at the impacts of energy effects. So this is a public housing development, and so they wanted to plan strategically to look specifically at the energy effect of these plantings over time. So the idea here, if this is public housing and it's going to cost public dollars to heat and cool these, how can we be most strategic in terms of our planting to be most effective in terms of planting vegetation to minimize some of those other costs? So it was something that they could use to kind of justify the tree planting program and tie that into energy effects. One other quick example I just want to share with you, which was shared by Mickey Merritt from Texas A&M Forest Service. This is a redevelopment project down, I believe, in the Houston area, Mandolin Gardens. So this was something where they were planting 341 trees in a redevelopment of about an 11-acre detention ponds in a village outside Houston. And so this is what it looks like today. And so it's quite different. It's a great community space, walking trails, water features, but it was a multi-use initiative where this was also supposed to be a landscape community area, but it also needed to serve to help with managing stormwater. So Mickey was able to engage a landscape architect and get the information on the planting plans and the species, and you can see what this looks like in the overhead. And he ran this through i3 Design. You can see on the right picture some of the houses that he traced with the parcel to try to see if there would be energy effects for some of those trees that were planted nearby there. And so the idea here is that, yeah, trees that are planted, newly planted trees aren't providing that many benefits. We can see down here in the middle, benefits to date for all those trees. It's really not that much, but over time, the impacts will be significant. So this is something that the landscape architects were very interested in going forward because they're trying to justify doing similar projects. And one of the things with tree planting projects is that there's a lot of excitement about planting trees, but maintaining trees over time where you're going to see the most benefits. That's something that folks don't get excited about. So this is something, this type of information that can kind of help justify some of the more operational and maintenance aspects of tree care. And also keeping in mind, we sometimes get hung up on dollar values, and I try to remind folks that sometimes it's the impacts. So going back to this particular project, the dual purpose was not just to provide a great community space, but also increasing flood protection. So over time, we can estimate what is the impact in terms of stormwater interception that those trees are going to provide. And then some of the impacts that we can't assess, say, just having that resource within that community. What does that mean to that community in terms of having a recreational space, stress reduction? There's so many things that we can't really quantify with iTree, but for the things that we can at least start that conversation. So this is iTree Design. It's a simple tool. I like to call it a gateway tool, or I even use the term the Tom Sawyer effect. How can I get other people to help me advance tree planting or tree care initiatives by putting this tool in their hands? So a number of folks who have linked their website to design. I've seen nurseries do this too, so that people who are considering planting trees can then look at how those trees might provide benefits to their homes. So there's a lot of strategic ways that you can use a tool like iTree Design. So that's what I wanted to share with you about design. Now getting back to some of the stats, this is a look since I went back to January 1st, 2013. And you can see Utah down here, ranked 38th when I ran this at a regional scale. So this is basically looking at state use, and design is functional in the U.S. and Canada. So you'll see that Ontario is up there at 18 and British Columbia at 30, which are larger regions. And then you can get an idea of some of the other states in your region too who may have been using design. So yeah, naturally, I think if I didn't put the whole list up there, but usually you'll this tool and gone through the process since January 1st, 2013. So Meredith, I think at this point I'll pause and see if there's any. So what I usually do is just use screen captures, and I actually did this for a homeowners association this past weekend to promote a tree planting project that they did. There's not a good way for having a way of something different than whether you have a GIS or maybe using Google Earth where you have a little bit more flexibility. So that's something we're definitely hearing from users. How can I, one, get information into design, and how can I get information out of design? So that's something that we have on our future list of to-do.
Perfect. Thanks, Al. I've got a question here from Mark. It says, as ECO moves from a server to desktop basis, will the U.S. Forest Service lose the ability to track who is using it, such as shown in a map of eco projects in the U.S.?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark, and that's one of the things that we were worried about also, is because it's a free program, so we need to know who's using it so we can justify it every time that Dave Nowak and Scott Macco go to the decision makers to get funding for the program. And so we're going to have some mechanisms built in there that allow us to still track who's using the tools. And we know that that's one of the limitations right now is we don't know who's using all the different tools and how they're using them. And so going forward with the way technology is increasing, we'll have some ways that will allow us to continue to track that going forward. So we won't lose that capability. It'll just be changed. And then actually, ECO is such a massive program. If you think about the weather and data requirements, there's still going to have to be some interactions where a user is going to have to go fetch that data from a server. So we're going to still house some external data. So if you pick 2010 and you want to look at whether that might have been particular for some type of reason. So we're still going to have some external interactions, but all the processing will happen on your desktop. But we just don't want folks to have to download such a massive program where they're storing multiple years of a national weather database and pollution database. So we'll have ways of keeping track of that.
Al, another question comparing ECO to the iTree streets. We do a lot of work with street tree inventories, and we just import the species and the DBH to run those iTree streets numbers, but we also have condition values associated with those inventories. Would you recommend that if we have the condition rating, that we use the ECO even on a street tree project, or in that particular case, should we stick to the streets model?
Well, going forward, our goal is to get folks to migrate over to ECO, because ECO is going to have a whole bunch of new features going forward. So we will start recommending heavily that folks who are interested in just using street tree or street tree inventory type applications move to ECO. And the other thing that we're doing is we're integrating in all the old reports from streets too. So what we want to do is, going forward in one of the future versions of ECO, to allow streets users to have that same type of functionality, so the same maintenance reporting, the same type of reports that you had available, and the same minimal requirements. So even species and DBH, ECO will accept that going forward. But if you have condition, I always say condition to me is kind of one of those things that if you're collecting data, you should grab that too. But it'll actually work. ECO will work with species and DBH. We actually kind of had a big disagreement among our team internally about that, but that's what it's going to be going forward. But we're still recommending at least species, DBH, and condition.
Great, and that kind of answers Wolfgang's question here, but he does add also, can we add custom species to ECO?
Right now you can't. The ECO species database, I believe, has around 6,500 or 7,000 species, and we need to develop that. So that's something that's also on our list to do, so that you'll have that same type of functionality that you do in streets, because we recognize that folks do that too. But we're integrating all the street species into ECO too, so the cultivars will be there, things that weren't there in the past. And so it's a pretty massive database in ECO. But yeah, we will be developing that type of functionality. It's a little bit more complex to do in ECO, so that's something that's on the list. When we have ECO ready, where we can tell streets users that this can do pretty much just about everything that streets can with all these other bells and whistles, then we'll have to have that type of capability too.
All right, it looks like Wolfgang's got one more thing he's typing here, but then maybe we can move on, Al, and we'll follow up with the rest of the questions here at the end.
So I see the question related to hydro, and yes, it's fairly complex. And actually, one of the things we just had a new person start with us named Robbie Colville, who's working at the Northern Research Station with Dr. Ted Andreni and his team, which are the hydro developers. And so that's one of the things that we are charged with, is trying to find a way to make the hydro model more accessible to users. So as we engage with Robbie and the team up there, we're going to try to develop more videos. There's a number of Eric Kuehler has been doing a great job of working with Ted Andreni, trying to bring some workshops on hydro too. Mostly, I think we've had a couple in the East Coast, one in Virginia, and then one in Atlanta. But going forward, we recognize that it's difficult to have those workshops, so we're really trying to move in a direction of trying to develop more video training if possible. So we hope in the future, as we can get past this next version of iTree, that we can then start looking at some of the other tools like hydro and design. But yeah, that's on the list, but we don't have anything planned for the moment right now. So Meredith, I'm going to continue on. I see that Wolfgang has a comment about the 80 species that they had to add to streets and eco zones, and so we can re-engage that at the end, but I do have quite a bit to get through, so I will keep continuing forward here.
Great, and I would just like to add that Al has been great and accommodating with a lot of the comments, especially here in the Intermountain West and other places. So the iTree team is really flexible. So as you have comments or issues and you work through these things, I think reaching out to Al and his team with species.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just
really
a process right now
to
get things into the databases and so forth. So. And then it requires updates, and so until we develop better systems. So it's with eco, just a real quick recap, is to get species in, those all have to be tied into a number of different factors within the locational database, and so it's not as simple as just trying to map it as you do in streets. So that kind of type of functionality still needs to be brought in and then tied into all the other databases. So we're not quite sure what that's going to look like, but it's something that will need to be addressed. So let's talk about iTree Canopy. This is another one of my favorite tools, and it's actually our most popular tool in terms of usage on the website from what we can gather just by doing our monitoring. And so this here again is just another online tool. And it allows folks to get at that question is, what is my canopy cover? And so, or other cover types that you might be interested in estimating. And so it's just a map, Google Map interface again. So we've been fortunate with the availability of Google Maps and the fact that they're updated fairly frequently that we've been allowed to develop some of these tools which have moved systems such as photo interpretation to become simple online tools. And then going forward, what we've done is we've been able to tie in some of the pollution estimates based on canopy coverage, where we can also do pollution estimating and some carbon sequestration and storage estimates for folks who go through the process of using canopy. And the other thing that we've tried to get away from is having GIS expertise or ArcGIS softwares. We know that that can be expensive, so we've also tried to increase the capacity for folks just to do simple tracings of outlines to look at an area of interest if they want to try to do a canopy survey. And this also produces a very generic report. It can also be used to do canopy change assessment, but there's a little bit of a process to that where you would have to go through, use this tool, and then there's an export process where you can take those same points and bring them into Google Earth to then do a change assessment. So it can be done, but it's a little bit of a cumbersome process to move through. So I'll just move through this rather quickly just to give you an idea. And who's using this? Anybody who's interested in canopy, this tool is highly available. This is probably one of our tools that gets the most international use because it works with Google Maps and they're pretty readily available all over the world. The quality can vary by region, even within the U.S. So that's one of the things that we are at the limit or the mercy of Google in terms of the quality of the image, and that can be challenging sometimes where they may not have leaf-on maps available, and you have to kind of really focus in to see, am I looking at tree cover when you're doing an assessment. So it's being used by anybody from municipal foresters to sustainability coordinators, school groups, researchers, a highly used tool by a wide variety of audience. And I found this map online. This is just South Salt Lake City, and it was something I was just looking through for some information online, and it had a nice easy boundary which I could use. Now if I had a shape file, a GIS shape file or a boundary file for this, I could use that, but I could also just trace this within the Canopy interface. So this is what the Canopy interface looks like, and you have an option of loading a GIS shape file or boundary file if you have that. You also have the ability to define your own project area, and that's what I did in this case. So you can see there's a tool at the upper left, kind of looks like a blue crown, that allows you just to trace in a polygon. So all I did here was just trace in the map of South Salt Lake City And what that does is then just turns that into a boundary within the Canopy interface. So that's easy to do, and that was just a matter of looking at two maps side by side and tracing it in a polygon. And then once you do that, you decide what are the cover types that you're interested in. So it can be as simple as tree canopy, no tree canopy, if all you want to do is get an estimate for your tree canopy. You can load in a saved scheme. So this is a scheme that it was actually from the Wisconsin DNR that they use for multi-community assessment. So if you have a number of communities who are interested in comparing apples and apples, it'd be wise if they all use the same cover scheme so they can share that. It's just a file that can be emailed. We have a couple that we have on the website that can be downloaded that pertain to iTree Hydro. So it's rather easy. You can do this manually, just create these also. There are some parameters that need to tie in, so that allow it to tie into ecosystem service component, which relates to the county, and then also if you're in a rural or urban area. One of the things that Canopy takes into consideration is trees provide more benefits when they're in urban areas in terms of air pollution value, because some of those, as they're intercepting pollutants, more of a population is going to benefit by that. So that same tree canopy is going to have a higher monetary value based on the EPA's BENMAP value when you're using an urban selection as opposed to rural values where trees in rural areas aren't going to affect as high a number of population. So this is one of the things that Canopy also takes into effect too, is some of those population features. But this is just a very simple page to set up. Once you have that set up, it really is just a random point generator at its core. So there's just a plus sign that you would click, and then it would generate a random point. You can kind of see a yellow point in the center of the map there. And then there's a drop-down menu that you can see the same cover classes that were set up in the previous screen. So it could be as simple, again, as any class scheme that you're interested in, or more complex. This one here, you see I have something called impervious UTC possible. That's something that the Wisconsin DNR used to try to capture, well, what is our potential urban tree canopy? And so that's something that a user would have to decide, well, what am I going to call potential UTC? In this case, I just ran through and I looked at some of the features when I hit a parking lot where it looked like that would be something where trees could possibly be planted. And it took me about 30 minutes just to motor through and do about 100 points. And up top you can see here, there is a small graph, and that's starting to show you the percent canopy. So in this case, for South Salt Lake City, after about 30 minutes, I can see I have about 10% canopy, plus or minus, say, 3% on a standard error. A high percentage of impervious. I had two different impervious classes, so roughly 65% impervious. It generates a very generic report, and so this, again, it's a little bit difficult to see, but you can see the tree canopy is about 10%. Those bars are showing you the range of the standard error again, so that's plus or minus 3%. And then at the bottom there, it gives you some of the estimates for the ecosystem services based on the county factors, the population of urban or rural, and then some of those values that you can see for the pollutants and also carbon sequestration and storage. So a simple tool, a number of different strategies, how this can be used. One of the things, baseline data for goal setting. So let's say for South Salt Lake City, like American Forest values, which I hear thrown around, that recommends 40% canopy, probably not realistic for South Salt Lake City. So just knowing what you have gives you a better idea of what might be an attainable goal, looking at the potential UTC that they had. So perhaps maybe 15% would be a pretty good stretch for them. But yeah, so having that baseline data to start from for more realistic goal setting is very valuable. You can look at a breakdown of different areas. So we could have looked at different areas within that city to see where are the priority areas for tree planting, and monitoring changes due to many factors, whether it be pest, land development, drought, storms. So just having that same data to then go back in time as things change and do another survey can be highly valuable. And one of the things is that iTree Hydro also requires a lot of cover type information. So a lot of folks that use iTree Hydro first use iTree Canopy to get those cover variables that are needed for that tool. And View also can be used with Canopy too. And this is just a non-traditional way that iTree Canopy is used. My colleague Jason Henning in Philadelphia did this, and what he was doing is just looking at a stream buffer. So looking at a stream in Pennsylvania, and then he just created a 100-foot buffer and did a canopy assessment of this to look at, well, what is the tree cover in there and what could potential tree cover be. And then he used Google Earth to look at change over 5 years. And so you can see those are just the two different images in 2006 and 2011, and there was about maybe a 4% increase in tree canopy cover, and you can see some of the values at the bottom related to that change over time. So it's just a novel approach to using this tool, so think beyond just doing a city assessment, whether you're comparing schools, neighborhoods. A lot of great uses for this tool. And we see a number of people using this in very different ways. So if folks are using it in different ways, please do share that with us, because that's something that we try to share with other folks too. And here's another way that we see, say, some other community using it to give them ideas. So that's Canopy. And so Canopy, again, it truly is a worldwide tool. And you can see here Utah is ranking at number 58, and so you're behind Dublin and Zagreb and Bio region. I'm not even sure where that is, but you're ahead of Manila in the Philippines in terms of using Canopy. So it's quite interesting in terms of the amount of use. And actually, I think our highest user is Australia. So they've done a number of studies with Canopy comparing all their capital cities, and they have a sustainability program that's built around some of those values. So yeah, it's a great tool, but think of it beyond just using it for city values. When you want to start looking at other types of information, it's something that you can easily access and do a quick assessment, as I did in literally less than an hour. I had a pretty decent estimate of canopy cover for South Salt Lake City. So that's iTree Canopy. So building on Canopy, I want to then conclude with just a quick run-through of iTree Landscape. So this is one of the tools that's not available but will be in the future. And one of the things I didn't mention is a timeline. And so timelines is something that we try to shy away from just because the development process is so complex. But what we're looking at is potentially late summer, early fall for having a landscape and eco release. And so that's our hope. We had hoped it would be available now, but some of the complexities that were involved, especially in both of these tools, which are just really major undertakings, has taken a lot more time than we had hoped. So things are still working. There's a number of people who have done just an amazing job at taking what was a concept and turning it into something that's starting to take shape rather nicely. And so the idea with trees, which we did not have in terms of a tool, was trying to get to that spatial aspect. Is how can we be more effective in terms of making spatial decisions? Where can we plant trees to have the most impact to protect human populations? So this is a tool that will start moving us in that direction to allow us to be more strategic in our planning in terms of locating trees in relationships to population. So what I did is I just kind of specced out a number of landscape screens. So don't dwell too much on the numbers here because it still is very much a work in progress, and I just had access to the tool, so I don't even know that the numbers are absolutely correct at this point, but it'll at least kind of give you a framework of what landscape is going to look like. And yeah, folks like maps, and this is one of the things, what kind of mapping does iTree have, and we haven't had anything, so this kind of at least gives us something that's a little bit beyond iTree view for anybody who might have experimented with that. So this is a landing page, and for all the work that has gone into this tool, it actually is very simple and accessible. So there are no manuals. It has a lot of information that'll walk you through the steps. It has kind of a timeline that just moves you through the steps from getting started. There's a very simple help function which gives you more detail. And you would just enter in an area of interest. Here I use Salt Lake City. This right now is serving up the National Land Cover and Data Imagery, so NLCD imagery. Eventually what we hope to do is integrate in more UTC high resolution imagery as that becomes available, but that's going to be a process, and that's not available everywhere. So as that starts becoming more available for certain areas, we'll start integrating that in. But it'll initially at least have this type of data set, because this is a national data set, and we have this for 2011 across the U.S. And so you can see here, this is just showing us to the right, tree canopy, impervious, and land cover, which are the three different areas of NLCD imagery. We could toggle those on and off if we just wanted to look at tree canopy in this particular case. Moving forward, just following the blue dot on the screen, we then can keep looking at data. There's a selection tool which allows you to, right now this is set up to pick up census blocks. Eventually we'll have the capability of allowing people to select by city, county, or state. But right now we're just working with census blocks at this particular stage. And so what I did here is just to keep this somewhat simple is I selected a block at West Valley City to the left, Mill Creek in the center, and East Mill Creek to the right, just for this simple little demonstration. We then can explore some of that data. So you can see down at the bottom, it's giving us the area estimates, the canopy information, and the pervious information. So it's serving up all the NLCD 2011 imagery, and recognizing that the NLCD imagery has its limitations because that tends to underestimate some of the canopy and impervious surfaces. So we realize that, but the only thing is that it is a data set that we can serve up to the whole country. So being a national tool set, we have to have something that we can fall back on until we have a national UTC data set which can be integrated into there. And that's going to be sometime way down the road before that happens. But it gives us something to work with, at least initially out of the gate. So we can see canopy, we can see impervious. Exploring further, you then could look at some of the characteristics. One of the other things with looking at census blocks is that there really is no good way of IDing those. So you can see to the lower left where it says ID, there is just a number, and that's how census blocks are labeled. And so you have a highlight option where you can highlight that, and it'll tie into the block so that you can at least correlate what you're looking at in the charts to the actual map. We can then look at some of the census information to those blocks. So we can start looking at information, whether it's population factors, minority population. We can look at some of the income attributes, so we can see where are the, the high value homes, things of that nature, and then start to make some correlations with canopy. So you can see here percent poverty. So in terms of looking at those human factors, population factors, and then also tying that together with tree canopy. Here's some of the home information. So we can see that the homes in East Mill Creek to the far right were a little bit more higher in value when we look at some of the variables comparing these three areas. I looked at them just using Google Street View. They all look very nice to me, but when you live in Chicago, a lot of things in Utah everything looks nice, basically. And here's the ecosystem services. So now we're at the tree benefits page, and so moved along, you can see here, just along that same timeline in the center. And so we have an option, you can see here, of looking at carbon, air pollution, and hydrology as it relates to those three different census blocks. There's the air pollution information, the hydrology information. So the block in East Mill Creek had the most canopy, and so most of the ecosystem services, that's our third one on the list, are in that census block. One of the other things that we're integrating into this is priority tree planting. So this here is just based on a number of different criteria which you can change the weight on. So right here you can see tree stocking level, tree cover per capita, and population density were set. But if you were interested in, say, social issues or equity issues, you then could change that to factor in below poverty level or minority population. So if you have areas where you're trying to get at looking at underserved communities, you can change some of the parameters to do different scenarios to do priority planting. So this can change, and so just running through the can scenario, this has shown me that that center block at Mill Creek was the area, what that would weigh as the highest priority. If you would change those variables around, it may have, say, made the block in West Valley then of a higher priority. So it's looking at a number of different factors, and honestly, I don't have all the information to know that that's fully functional at the time, but it seemed to be reasonable from what I was figuring it would do. And so I also had you have the capability of looking at charts too. So it has some minor reporting capabilities that are looking really nice in terms of the charts that it can generate based on some of those earlier features that I showed you. So that's the pollution values there that we can see listed into each one of those census blocks. Now you can imagine if you're looking at 25 different blocks, this chart can be pretty cumbersome and a little bit difficult to digest. So I thought, well, why don't we try it with Salt Lake City too, just to see if I can fire up those particular census blocks. And that was easy enough to do. There's actually a feature up here which allows you to select a block, so you can essentially kind of just make a big selection and grab a bunch of blocks, and you could toggle on and off a block. So this is basically the same area that we were looking at here, and you can see this is, it looks like a high transportation corridor, a lot of railways right here, and most of the populations of that area are to the right of the highway there. And this was the block which had the highest canopy, which was just about 9%. And remember, I did about a 10% canopy cover using iTree Canopy, and I know this is underestimating because this is using NLCD, but we can run this through the priority planting process too, and it's showing me that the area with the already high percent canopy was the lowest priority, and this block here was a higher priority, and this area that had the largest transportation corridor was an area of lower priority, and that's probably just because there's not a high population living in that area. You could change those variables and this might come out somewhat different. So it's kind of an interesting and a neat tool to explore around with. I haven't had much time working with this. I've been a little bit more involved with eco than landscape, but eventually this will be put into my wheelhouse too, to kind of work with a little bit more to help folks become more familiar with the processes, but still very much a work in process. So yeah, we think it's an exciting tool, and hopefully it'll allow folks to have an easy interface again, just to start doing some simple exploration of canopy cover, and then also tying that into population factors. So that's landscape at a glance, and just real quick recap, there's a number of resources on the website as I tie this up. If you want, feel free to get a hold of me or my colleague Jason Henney in that support. There's really only two of us that kind of help folks right now with support issues, so generally we're the gatekeepers who help folks use all the tools. So feel free to contact us, and we'd be glad and happy to help you along, answer any questions going forward. And my contact information is there. I'll leave all those tools up there. Meredith, I don't know how we're doing on time, but I'd be glad to take any questions if any folks have any.
Thank you so much, Al. We're a little bit over time, but I think we can take a few minutes to answer any questions. So if you've been hesitating, go ahead and type those questions into the chat pod. I had a question about the users. Now that iTree has kind of moved into this new web-based protocol, are you seeing a change in the user group? I think
we're definitely seeing an expansion
from when it had originally started.
So we're starting to see more people from a wide variety. So I hear from landscape architects who are interested in trying to use tools like hydro for doing projects where they're looking at the impact of trees. And we're seeing school groups right now. We have a person who is specifically working with iTree Design to develop curriculum for middle schools. So I think that's one of the great things about having the online platform and a tool and a toolkit that speaks to different scales, where if you're looking at watershed scale level projects, or you're looking at simple homes or a block, there are tools that you can pretty much pull off the shelf and use to address some of those issues. So yeah, it's definitely changed from, I think, maybe a tool set that was initially designed to engage municipal foresters, where iTree Streets was kind of in the wheelhouse for folks who manage street trees. ECO was a little bit more complex tool, or U4 at the time. So yeah, I think it's widening now, which is great to see.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Al. We are probably out of time here. I just want to remind everyone that this webinar will be recorded, so feel free to go back and reference it if you didn't get